The neighbor. Some neighborhoods hide their secrets better than others. In Oakridge, where the houses huddle close together like old women sharing gossip, secrets have a way of spilling over fences and through windows, eventually finding their way to the middle school that sits at the neighborhood's heart. Timber Middle School, TMS to the kids who walk its halls, was where I learned that sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes they're living next door, watching from windows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I was in 7th grade that year, awkwardly balanced between childhood and something else, not quite sure which way to fall. Our school divided lunch into 2 periods. First lunch for all 6th graders and some 7th graders, second lunch for the remaining 7th graders and all 8th graders. My class had first lunch, a fact I was grateful for on that overcast Tuesday in early October. The weather had been threatening rain all morning, dark clouds hanging low over the school like a bad omen. During first period, my English teacher, Mrs. Callahan, kept glancing nervously at the windows as if expecting something worse than rain. By lunch, the sky had darkened to the color of an old bruise, and a strange electric tension filled the air that had nothing to do with the coming storm. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual chaos, plastic trays clattering, milk cartons being stabbed with straws, the overlapping voices of preteens trying to be heard over one another. I sat with my friends Eric, Danny, and Brianna at our usual table near the windows that looked out toward the residential street where many students lived. Through the rain-speckled glass, I could see the row of houses directly facing the school, their front yards separated from campus by only a narrow street and a chain-link fence. "Did you finish the math homework?" Brianna asked, pushing her untouched green beans around her tray. "Haven't even started," Danny admitted, mouth full of pizza. "Hey, did you guys see that weird guy standing by the fence this morning?" I hadn't, but Eric nodded. "Yeah, some old dude just staring at the playground during gym. Mr. Hernandez went over and talked to him, and he walked away. Probably just some creep," Brianna said with the world-weary sigh of a 13-year-old who thinks she understands everything. I was about to ask more when it happened, for loud booms echoed through the cafeteria, so powerful they seemed to rattle the windows. My first thought was thunder, though it sounded wrong somehow, too distinct, too deliberate for a heartbeat. Everyone froze. Then someone screamed, and it was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, everyone was screaming, jumping up from tables, some diving underneath them. Before I could process what was happening, the double doors at the entrance to the cafeteria burst open. Mr. Reeves, the head of campus security, charged in with 2 other security guards behind him. His face was tight with fear, and he was shouting over the chaos. "Everyone move to the multi-purpose room now. This is not a drill. Leave your food and move." Kids who had been in line buying lunch were forced to abandon their trays. A 6th grade girl started crying as a security guard grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. Someone knocked over a chair with a loud clatter, causing another wave of screams. "What's happening?" Eric shouted, grabbing his backpack. Nobody answered him. Teachers and staff were suddenly everywhere, herding us like panicked sheep toward the multi-purpose room adjoining the cafeteria. I lost sight of Danny in the crowd, but managed to stay with Eric and Brianna as we were swept along with the tide of bodies. The multi-purpose room was huge. It served as our gymnasium, assembly hall, and theater. The back wall was made entirely of glass, offering a panoramic view of the street and houses beyond. As we stumbled inside, I noticed campus security staff rushing to pull heavy black curtains across those windows, blocking our view of the outside world, and more importantly, blocking the outside world's view of us. Adults positioned themselves at every exit, their faces masked with the kind of forced calm that only makes kids more anxious. No one was telling us what was happening, which meant it was bad, really bad. The room filled quickly with confused, frightened students. Some were crying. Others were texting frantically on phones they weren't supposed to have out during school hours. Teachers moved through the crowd, shushing the loudest kids, offering empty reassurances to others. "This is insane," Eric muttered, craning his neck to see over the crowd. "I'm going to find out what's going on." Before I could stop him, he slipped away, weaving through clusters of students toward Mr. Zimmer, one of the less intimidating security guards stationed by the side exit. I watched as Eric spoke to him, Mr. Zimmer's face growing serious as he bent down to Eric's level. After a brief exchange, Eric made his way back to us, his face pale beneath his freckles. "What did he say?" Brianna demanded, grabbing Eric's arm. Eric swallowed hard before answering. "You know those houses right in front of the school?" "Yeah," I replied, thinking of the view we'd just had through the cafeteria windows. "There's this guy who lives in the blue one with the peeling paint. Mr. Zimmer says he's mentally disabled or something. But that's not all." Eric lowered his voice, forcing us to lean closer. "He barricaded himself inside his house this morning when the police tried to evict him. He's threatening to kill himself and any cops who try to come in." "Oh my God," Brianna whispered, her eyes wide. "That's not the worst part." Eric continued. "Mr. Zimmer said the guy was walking around outside the school earlier, watching kids, like really watching them, and he hesitated, looking around to make sure no teachers were within earshot. He's a registered sex offender." My stomach twisted into a cold knot. I thought about the houses I passed every day walking to and from school, the faces I glimpsed in windows, the strangers who nodded hello on the sidewalk. Had this man been there all along, watching us, waiting? "Those booms," Brianna said suddenly. "Were those gunshots?" Eric shrugged. "Mr. Zimmer wouldn't say. But why else would they rush us in here and cover the windows?" The three of us fell silent, the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on us like the storm clouds outside. Around us, other students were huddled in similar groups, sharing theories and fears in hushed voices. The minutes dragged by with excruciating slowness. We remained trapped in the multi-purpose room for over an hour, an eternity in the world of anxious teenagers. The longer we waited, the more elaborate the rumors became. Someone claimed the man had a bomb. Another said he had taken hostages. A sixth grader was convinced he had gotten inside the school and was hiding somewhere, waiting to grab a kid. Finally, Principal Harper appeared at the front of the room, using a megaphone to cut through the noise. "Attention, students. The situation outside has been contained by law enforcement. We will be maintaining modified lockdown procedures for the remainder of the day as a precaution. Teachers will now escort you to your classrooms in small groups. Please remain calm and follow all staff instructions." One by one, classes were called and let out by their teachers. When my group was finally summoned, I felt a strange reluctance to leave the crowded room. There was safety in numbers, and the hallways suddenly seemed dangerous, full of shadows and corners where someone could hide. Mrs. Peterson, our science teacher, led us through the eerily quiet corridors. The silence felt wrong in a building usually teeming with the sounds of slamming lockers, squeaking sneakers, and teenage voices. Outside the windows, I could see police cars lining the street, their lights flashing against the darkened sky. "Keep moving," Mrs. Peterson urged when a few of us slowed to look, eyes forward. Back in the classroom, no one could focus on the lesson about cellular respiration. Mrs. Peterson made a half-hearted attempt to teach before giving up and letting us work quietly on homework or read. Most kids spent the time whispering about what had happened, each version of events more dramatic than the last. When the final bell rang at 3:15, we weren't released as usual. Instead, An announcement informed us that all students would be dismissed directly to buses or parents, no walkers allowed. Those of us who normally walked home groaned in frustration. "My mom can't pick me up," Brianna said, her voice tinged with worry. "She's at work until 6. You can ride my bus?" I offered. "My mom won't mind if you hang out until your mom gets home." As we filed out to the buses, under the watchful eyes of teachers and security, I spotted a crowd gathered at the end of the block. Police had cordoned off the area around the Blue House, and officers in tactical gear moved with purpose around the perimeter. An ambulance sat nearby, its back doors open but empty. "Do you think they got him?" Eric asked, following my gaze. "I hope so," I murmured. But something told me it wasn't over. I didn't learn the full story until later that night, when the local news ran a segment on the incident at Timber Middle School. A man named Raymond Stacks, 47, had barricaded himself in his home when county officials arrived with an eviction notice. Neighbors reported that Stacks had become increasingly erratic in recent weeks, shouting at passersby and standing for hours at his front window, watching the school across the street. What the news didn't mention, what I learned the next day from Brandy Matthews, who lived 2 doors down from Stacks, was far more disturbing. He's been weird for years. Brandy told us during study hall, her voice low and intense. "Last Halloween, I was out trick-or-treating with my little brother, and we walked past his house. He was at the window, but not like normal people who put out candy and stuff. What was he doing?" I asked, though something in me didn't want to know. Brandy's eyes darted around to make sure no teachers were listening. He was cutting his arm with a knife, like really cutting it, and then he used the blood to write on the window. "Write what?" Eric demanded. "Don't come here or I'll kill you," Brandy whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "We thought it was just some creepy Halloween decoration, you know, like fake blood or whatever. My mom reported it, but the police just said they'd check on him. Nothing happened." I felt sick, imagining those words written in blood, imagining the man who wrote them watching children walk past his house every day. "Did they arrest him yesterday?" Brianna asked. Brandy shook her head. "That's the thing. When the SWAT team finally went in, he was gone. Somehow, he slipped out the back while everyone was watching the front. They found weird stuff in his house, though. My dad's friend is a cop, and he told my dad they found pictures." She paused meaningfully. "Pictures of kids from our school, taken through his window." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "So, he's just out there somewhere? They'll find him," Eric said with a confidence I didn't share. "They have to." But they didn't find him, not that day, not the next. Life at TMS settled into a new normal. Security was increased. Parents started driving kids who used to walk. Teachers watched the windows during class, their eyes constantly scanning the street beyond. 2 weeks after the lockdown, they installed security cameras along the fence line. A month after, they began construction on a taller, solid fence to replace the chain-link one that had stood there for decades. The Blue House remained empty, its windows dark, a no trespassing sign posted on the door. Sometimes, walking home never alone now, always in groups as our parents insisted, I would look at that house and wonder where Raymond Stacks had gone. Was he in another town, another state, starting over near another school? Or was he still here, hiding somewhere, watching and waiting? I got my answer 6 months later. On a warm April evening, I was in my bedroom doing homework when my mom called me downstairs. Her voice tight, with an emotion I couldn't identify. She and my dad were standing in the living room, the local news playing on the TV. A reporter stood in front of a familiar scene, the woods behind our school's athletic fields. Officials confirmed that the body discovered by hikers this morning has been identified as Raymond Stacks, the man who triggered a lockdown at Timber Middle School last October. Authorities believe Stacks died of exposure shortly after fleeing his home during the police standoff. The body was found in a small cave approximately 2 miles from the school, along with a journal that police say contains disturbing content they are not ready to disclose at this time. Relief washed over me. He was gone. Really gone, followed immediately by a strange, unsettling guilt. This broken, dangerous man had died alone in the woods while we feared him, while we imagined him lurking behind every corner. The reporter continued, sources close to the investigation tell us that Stacks, who suffered from schizophrenia, had stopped taking his medication months before the incident. His journal entries suggest he believed children at the school were sending him secret messages and that certain faculty members were conspiring against him. My mom turned off the TV, her face troubled. At least it's over now, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it ever really over? Though, Raymond Stacks is gone, but the fear he planted remains, sprouting new roots with each school shooting headline, each Amber Alert, each reminder that the world is full of broken people who sometimes break others. Years later, long after I'd moved on to high school, my mom told me that parents had petitioned to have the Blue House torn down. Too many bad memories. They said, too much darkness absorbed into its walls. The city refused. It was private property, after all, but no one would buy it. It sat empty for years. A monument to fear. Windows like blind eyes staring at the school where children learned that monsters were real. I'm in college now, studying psychology with a focus on mental health intervention. Sometimes I think about Raymond Stacks, about the system that failed him and the children he terrified. I think about that Halloween night when Brandy saw him cutting himself, writing his desperate warning in blood, a cry for help disguised as a threat. I wonder if someone had listened then, really listened. Would things have turned out differently? Would we have still spent an hour huddled in the multi-purpose room, imagining the worst? Would he have still died alone in those woods? His broken mind his only companion? I'll never know. But I've learned this much. Neighborhoods like Oakridge don't just hide their secrets, they create them. Nurture them in silence and neglect until they grow too large to contain. And when those secrets finally break free, it's often the most vulnerable who suffer, both the Raymond Stackses of the world and the children who will never again feel completely safe in their classrooms. The Blue House was finally torn down my senior year of high school. They built a small park in its place with benches and flowers and a little plaque dedicating it to community safety and wellness. Most people who sit there now don't know its history, don't feel the echoes of that October day when 4 loud booms, which turned out to be Stacks firing a shotgun into the air behind his house, changed how we saw our world. But I remember, and sometimes, when I drive past that park on visits home, I imagine I can see a figure at the edge of the playground, watching the children at the school across the street, waiting for someone to notice him before it's too late.